All of these events took place over about 3 years, starting in 2011, when I moved into an old cottage. A close friend from childhood asked if I wanted to be her roommate, and since I was eager to move out of my parents' place while she needed help with rent, it felt like a great setup. The cottage itself was incredibly old, built sometime in the late 1700s, though no one knew the exact year. The road it stood on still carried the name of the original family that had owned the land, a family that had once been prominent tobacco farmers before the area was developed into what is now one of the biggest metropolitan cities in the country. If you search for historic American colonial homes, you'd find pictures that look eerily similar to this one. At first, we thought it might have been used as servant quarters, but later research pointed toward it being a stable. That theory made sense. One time, our dog dug up an old horseshoe from the yard. I still have it. The night we moved in, I immediately felt uneasy. The cottage had its share of oddities. There were no doors leading upstairs to my bedroom or to the downstairs bedroom. My friend's room was a later addition, built sometime in the 1980s. The previous owners had also expanded the place to add a kitchen and a bathroom since the original structure had neither. Now that you have an idea of the house, let me explain why I'm sharing this. From the moment we settled in, I had an overwhelming sensation of being watched. The house was always cold, dim, and had a dampness like an old basement. Of course, that was to be expected with a home that old, but something felt off. It started with scratching noises. Every night, I'd wake up to the sound of something scratching under my bed, right near my head. At first, I assumed it was mice, but after paying closer attention, I realized the sound was too slow and deliberate, like a long, dragging scrape followed by a pause, then repeated. I'd pull my blankets over my head, cover my ears, and squeeze my eyes shut. I was a 24-year-old guy at the time, but I felt like a scared little kid. I wasn't about to confront whatever was making that sound. One night, I was still awake when the noise started. It began on the far side of the room, high up on the wall, then slowly made its way downward until it reached the space beneath me. Then, just as slowly, it moved across the floor to the opposite wall, before disappearing completely. Here's why I knew it wasn't mice. My bedroom walls were solid wood, with no gaps or hollow spaces. The logs on the inside were the same as those on the outside. The floor and ceiling were built the same way, no empty cavities. This was a sturdy, old-fashioned structure, meaning there was nowhere for a rodent to burrow. I was terrified. I started sleeping downstairs. My roommate noticed and asked me what was wrong, so I told her. That's when she admitted she'd been hearing the same noises when she was home alone. This was within the first week of moving in. Now, here's where it gets really unsettling. When we first arrived, I had to remove all the screws from the windows because the previous tenant had bolted them shut. One of the exterior doors had also been screwed closed. As we cleaned the kitchen, we found an odd pile of what we thought was rabbit food in the oven. We also discovered stacks upon stacks of mail-order catalogs that the last tenant had been receiving, hundreds of them. We laughed at the time, joking that the guy was a paranoid shut-in. Looking back, I don't think we were far from the truth. After that, we started sleeping in the living room. Being in the same space made us feel safer. That is, until one night when I had a vivid dream. In the dream, I could see myself sleeping from a third-person view, and a dark presence began approaching me. It loomed closer and closer, and suddenly, I felt immense pressure in my head, accompanied by a sharp, high-pitched ringing. The sensation became unbearable, and just as I jolted awake, the television flicked off on its own, like someone had pressed the remote. Now, we'd been having issues with the TV turning on and off randomly, but this time it was too perfectly timed to ignore. I was positive I had turned it off before going to bed, so why had it been on in the first place? After that, we started sleeping in my friend's room instead. She claimed that nothing strange ever happened in there. Maybe because it was part of the newer addition. Either way, whatever was in that house seemed to have an odd sense of humor because, funnily enough, we ended up falling for each other. We're now married and have been together for 6 years, currently trying for a baby. One afternoon, while reading upstairs, I was nearly dozing off when my bedroom window started opening and shutting by itself. First, I ignored it, but the next day I recreated the same conditions and sure enough, it happened again. only when I was there. By then, I had reached my limit. I finally snapped and yelled at whatever was there, demanding that it leave us alone. I told it I was done with its games. For a while, things seemed to calm down. But then, when I was home alone, strange things kept happening. The alarm clocks would start blaring the second my wife left the house. Cabinets and drawers would be open when I hadn't touched them. Someone or something pounded on the front door, but when I checked, no one was there. Over time, though, the activity faded. I think as I matured, the spirit lost interest in tormenting me. These days, my in-laws live in that house. They were actually my landlords back then. Now, the cottage feels warm and inviting. I can visit by myself without that oppressive, eerie feeling. The house remains in the family, as my mother-in-law refuses to sell it. I went from being a skeptical 20-something to the guy who cleans out the gutters and handles maintenance for a home I've grown to cherish. When my father-in-law passed away, I spent some time alone in the house, wondering if I'd hear one last familiar knock. But nothing came. Now, whenever I visit, there's no fear, just a sense of warmth and comfort. Looking back, I don't think the presence was malevolent. Maybe it was more like a guardian spirit, keeping an eye on us until we grew up. It always seemed more interested in me than my wife. Maybe I was just more open to it. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal, more so than her. My mother swears she's seen spirits before, so maybe it runs in my family. We never really talked about it growing up, but every now and then old stories surface. Mostly, they're harmless ones. I guess I just come from a line of people who are a little more in tune with things beyond this world. The cabin had seen better days. The closest town was a long, empty drive away, past twisting roads that seemed to erase all traces of human life. No one came through unless they had a reason, and out here there were few good ones. From the moment I moved in, something felt off. The solar battery barely held a charge, leaving me in complete darkness at night except for my weak headlamp and the occasional glint of moonlight. The nights stretched on forever, restless and suffocating. First, it was the bats. Dozens of them, rustling in the rafters, their claws scratching and their sharp cries making it impossible to sleep. Then something heavier, footsteps on the porch. The first time I heard them, I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But deep down, I knew better. Raccoons don't move with slow, deliberate steps. They don't pause like they're listening, like they're waiting. 2 months in, the scratching started. At first, just along the edges of the porch. Then closer, on the door. Something was testing the cabin. Every time I stepped outside, the air felt heavy, the trees looming tall, pressing in, like they were hiding something just beyond my sight. I started keeping my rifle close, even though I technically wasn't supposed to have one. But tell me, who the hell lives alone out here and doesn't arm themselves? Tuesday nights were my grocery run, the only time I'd leave after dark. The drive back was always tense, headlights barely cutting through the suffocating blackness of the forest. On this particular night, I felt it before I even pulled up. A deep, gut-level wrongness, like a warning. Something was waiting for me. I stepped out, keys in hand, and then I saw them. 2 eyes hovering in the darkness just above my front door. Too high for a coyote, too low for a deer. About 4 feet up. And they didn't move. My breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, get back in the car. I shouted, "Get the hell out of here." The eyes didn't move. Then slowly they sank lower, creeping forward. I grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack and hurled it. The log hit the ground with a dull thud. The thing flinched back, but made no sound. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them. The solar power was out again, so I was doing this blind. I could hear its breathing, slow, measured, too controlled for an animal, too aware. I got inside and grabbed my rifle. When I stepped back out, it was still there, but closer now, just at the edge of my weak headlamp's glow. My pulse thundered in my ears as I loaded the gun, never looking away. One-handed, I threw another piece of wood. This time, it moved, slowly, then melted back into the trees. No sound, no rush of movement, just gone. That night, I downed 4 beers and slept with my rifle in my arms. Morning came, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, until the trail crew arrived. They found mountain lion tracks everywhere, all over the porch near the old rocking chair, even circling the cabin. But here's the thing. After that night, I kept hearing it. The creak of the rocker in the dead of night. Footsteps on the porch. I grab my gun, throw the door open, nothing. No movement, no sound. And when I checked the ground, no new tracks. It had been raining for weeks. There should have been prints. I've been stalked by mountain lions before. They stay hidden. Watch from a distance. They don't taunt you. They don't play games with you. But something was out there. And whatever it was definitely playing. That night, I was living on the edge of a vast nature reserve in a tiny, worn-down cabin. Calling it remote wouldn't do it justice. The only way to reach it was a narrow, 4-mile path of dirt and gravel that twisted through a dense forest. In some places, the trees grew so close together it felt like driving through a tunnel of gnarled branches. There were no streetlights, no nearby houses, and no phone signal. Just me, the wilderness, and whatever else lived out there. The cabin itself was basic, no electricity, and, worst of all, no way to lock the door. The owner refused to let anyone ruin their off-grid retreat with modern updates. At first, I didn't mind. I'd grown up in a rural area and was used to roughing it. My roommate, however, was an intern with the Park Service, a city kid through and through. He shrugged off the lack of a lock. "What, is a raccoon gonna break in?" he joked. I didn't laugh. It started with noises at night. At first, I brushed them off as normal wildlife. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. But these weren't the usual scurrying sounds or the rustle of wind through the branches. No, these were slow, heavy footsteps crunching through the brush. At first, I convinced myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. But as the nights passed, the pattern became too deliberate to ignore. The footsteps always started far away, moving slowly through the trees. Never running, never scurrying, just walking. Then they would stop, always in the thickest part of the forest, where I couldn't see a thing beyond the dense foliage. I'd hold my breath, listening. Sometimes everything would go eerily silent. Other times, I swore I could hear breathing. Not the quick, nervous sniffing of a deer, nor the snort of a wild boar. Something slower, heavier. Then nothing. Minutes would pass, maybe an hour, and just when I started to think I had imagined it, the footsteps would begin again. And this time, closer. A deep unease settled into my bones. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that came with it. That unmistakable sensation that something was watching me. Even during the day, the land that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretched longer, and no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes tracking my every move. The cabin door didn't lock. That thought consumed me at night as the footsteps continued. My mind raced with possibilities. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it wasn't just my imagination? What if one night, whatever was out there decided to come inside? I started sleeping in my car. It felt safer, even if that safety was just an illusion. I parked more than an acre away from the cabin, thinking the distance would help. Didn't. The footsteps still came. The breaking point came on a night I'll never forget. It was past midnight. I was in the driver's seat, reclined, blanket pulled to my chest, when I heard them again, those same slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. But this time, they didn't stop at the tree line. They kept coming. I sat up, barely breathing. The night was pitch black, the forest a wall of darkness beyond my windshield. Couldn't see a thing, but I could hear it. A twig snapped. Then, just outside my car, I heard a long, wheezing breath. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, nearly dropping them. When I turned the ignition, the headlights flooded the darkness, revealing nothing. I threw the car into reverse and got the hell out of there. By morning, I packed my things and left for good. My roommate, still convinced I was imagining things, decided to stay. But he didn't last a month. He got robbed, twice. After the second time, he finally set up motion-activated cameras. What they captured made my stomach drop. A man with long, unkempt hair had been out there, hiding in the trees, watching us, watching me. When I was 8 years old, my dad, Richard, took my older brother, James, and me to a secluded cabin deep in the Scottish Highlands for a week-long holiday. We also brought along our tabby cat, Shadow. The cabin was cozy but lonely, surrounded by dense forest and far from the nearest town. The bedrooms were upstairs, and mine was the furthest from the others, positioned right where the trees began. A single window sat beside my bed, giving me a clear view of an old, twisted oak tree, one I had failed to climb the previous afternoon. There were no curtains or blinds to block out the night. One evening, I was feeling homesick and couldn't sleep. Shadow lay curled beside me while I read a comic book under my flashlight. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just a branch moving in the wind, but then the tapping turned into a deliberate rhythm, like knuckles rapping against the glass. Then came the whispering. "Let me in, boy. It's me, Dad." A voice murmured from the other side. My whole body went cold. I knew it wasn't my father. I wanted to cry out, but fear locked me in place. "Come on, Daniel," the voice coaxed. "It's cold out here. Let me in for a hug." I turned towards the window, clutching Shadow. The cat's fur bristled beneath my hands, and he let out a low, angry hiss. I buried my face in his fur, willing the voice to go away. Then came a sound that still chills me to this day, a long, scraping noise that sent a shiver up my spine. I dared to glance up. The figure outside was grinning, his mouth stretched far too wide, his eyes glinting with a sinister light as he dragged a small knife across the glass, producing that terrible screeching sound. I finally found my voice and screamed. The man's grin twisted into something furious and surprised. His eyes locked onto mine before flicking toward the doorway. At that moment, my father burst into the room, gripping his old shotgun. My brother was right behind him, clutching a cricket bat. The man outside went pale. He stumbled backward, and I heard his heavy footsteps hitting the ground. My dad rushed to the window just in time to see the shadowy figure vanish into the forest. None of us slept that night. My father sat by the window, knife in hand, while my brother stayed beside me on the bed. The police arrived in the morning, taking pictures of the scratches on the glass and the footprints in the frost-covered earth below. They promised to keep an eye on the area, but we packed up and left that very day, never returning. The man was never caught. Even now, I can still hear his voice, soft yet coaxing, like a serpent lulling its prey. And I still remember the sound of his footsteps crunching through the snow as he called after me. Shadow, now 15 and as fierce as ever, remains my hero. He never stopped hissing until that thing outside was gone. And I've never stopped double-checking that my windows are locked at night. Shudder. This is something that happened to me and my best friend back when we were in high school. It was around 2005 in a small town in upstate New York. We met in elementary school and are still friends to this day. We're both around 28 now. To give some background, my friend Elle and I became close the moment we met and were practically inseparable. We spent so much time at each other's houses that her mom set up a guest room just for me. I had clothes, toys, and even pictures hanging on the walls. Elle's mom, Margaret, treated me like her second daughter. She had always wanted 2 girls and loved having me around. Now, on to the unsettling part. This happened when Elle and I were in our sophomore year of high school. Margaret had been divorced for some time and had gone on a few dates, often meeting men on dating websites like Match.com. She had been talking to one particular guy for a few weeks and was really excited about him. She would always run potential dates by us first, saying she needed her daughter's opinions before going out with anyone. One evening, she called us into her room to show us the guy's profile. It was pretty basic, the kind you'd expect from a middle-aged man using an online dating site in 2005. His headline read, "Seeking a Strong Woman." I made a joke about how odd his wording was, but we moved on. The profile talked about his work as a metalworker, his love of steel, and how his job at the foundry kept him just warm enough. Something about it felt off, but he looked normal enough in his photos. Dark, neatly trimmed hair, a beard, a strong jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a decent build for a guy in his early 40s. I still mentioned that something seemed strange. Elle joked that her mom had a habit of picking the socially awkward ones, and we laughed, knowing she wasn't wrong. Margaret had met some odd characters online before. In the end, we encouraged her to go for it, and they planned to meet for dinner. He had to drive about 2 hours to get to our town, and from there, they'd take one car into the city. Elle and I helped Margaret pick out her outfit, did her hair and makeup, and then went back upstairs so she could have some time before the date. We were in Elle's room, painting her wall, listening to music, and joking around when it happened. He let himself in. No knock, no doorbell. The dogs didn't bark. We didn't hear anything until a low voice suddenly spoke behind us. Well, I didn't know I was getting two for the price of one. We froze. Our hearts nearly stopped. Neither of us had any idea how long he had been standing there. He chuckled, walking toward us casually, like he had all the time in the world. The scent of cigarettes filled the room, and for a moment, it felt like we were living out our own horror movie. That's when I realized he looked similar to the man in the pictures Margaret had shown us, but not quite. His hair was salt and pepper instead of jet black, and his eyes, they weren't blue, they were black. Not dark brown, completely black, like there was no distinction between pupil and iris. I opened my mouth to say something, but Margaret's voice suddenly cut through the tension from downstairs. Who got hurt? She must have thought we were messing around and someone got injured, which wasn't unusual for us. She came upstairs and froze when she saw him blocking our way. He turned to her, dropping his arms slightly, and in a much more normal tone said, "Margaret, you look beautiful." I knocked, but no one answered. I hope it's okay that I let myself in. Then he looked at us. "These are your girls? They're beautiful, just like their mommy." The way he said mommy made my skin crawl. Elle and I exchanged glances, both silently screaming at Margaret that something was very wrong. She gave us a quick look of acknowledgement before turning back to him with a forced smile. "Next time, just ring the bell. I'll let you in." He nodded and stepped forward to hug her like they were old friends. She looked at us over his shoulder, rolling her eyes as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" Then she quickly ushered him downstairs, apologizing as she told him that letting himself in wasn't appropriate. He kept saying sorry over and over. The second they were out of sight, Elle and I grabbed our phones and texted her about what he had said. About 10 minutes later, we heard her footsteps coming back upstairs. She shut the door behind her and asked if we were okay. She hugged us, apologized, and explained that he said we reminded him of his daughters and hadn't meant to scare us. We nodded, though we weren't convinced. She left for her date, promising to check in every hour. The second she was gone, we started talking over each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Something wasn't right. A few hours later, we got a text from her. "I'm okay, but officially creeped out. Coming home now." We were on edge, pacing until we saw headlights pull into the driveway. She got out of the car fast, waved off the driver, and rushed inside. "Turn off the lights. Let's go upstairs," she said, locking the door behind her. Up in Elle's room, we peeked out the window. His truck was still idling in the driveway. She spilled everything. He had taken her to a cabin in the woods, talking the whole way about how easy it was to get her alone. He kept repeating that he liked strong women because they put up a fight. Then he started asking weird questions about us. What we got in trouble for as kids, how she disciplined us, and if she'd ever sacrifice herself for one of her girls. On the way home, he pulled out his flip phone and started showing her pictures of us, screenshots of our Facebook photos. He told her she should be proud of how well she had raised us. Just then, the truck outside shut off. Margaret grabbed her phone and called the sheriff, who, luckily, lived just a few houses down. Just as we saw the man step out of his truck with a duffel bag, the sheriff pulled up behind him. The guy panicked, threw the bag back in, and tried to drive off, but he was blocked. Instead, he tore through the yard, peeling away into the night. We never heard if he was caught. For months, we were paranoid. We occasionally got creepy messages online, 2 of which we knew were from him. But after about 3 months, they stopped. It's been years now, and we still hope we never see that man again. I've always had a deep fascination with the forest. There's something unique about how it can make you feel so many conflicting emotions at the same time. The endless rows of nearly identical tree trunks stretching into the distance, all appearing the same, yet each one distinct in its own way. The dense canopy above, thick with leaves, somehow manages to block out the sunlight while also wrapping you in a secluded, hidden world. When I was a kid, the forest was our entire world. We spent nearly all our free time there, as long as we made it home in time for dinner. The rest of the day was ours, and looking back, I can say those times gave me some of the most unforgettable experiences of my life. But one memory in particular has stuck with me, clear as if it happened yesterday. The woods near our homes had no secrets from us, or so we thought. We had wandered through acres and acres of land, never once questioning how much ground the forest truly covered. It wasn't something we considered as kids. We just gathered together and let the day lead us wherever it wanted. There were familiar landmarks. An old tree stump that meant home was 5 minutes away, a clearing that told us we had 10 more minutes, and a rundown wooden shack that marked the 20-minute point. We never mapped it out, never wrote it down. We just knew. But on this particular day, we kept walking further. No one decided it. It just happened naturally. We passed all our usual markers, laughing, joking, and moving at an easy pace. Yet somehow, the scenery kept passing by, and nothing ever seemed different until we saw the clearing. The moment we stepped into it, we all went silent. Our voices, our laughter, our chatter, all stopped in perfect unison. Something felt wrong. For one, none of us recognized this place. The wall of trees simply vanished behind us, and ahead lay an open space in a near-perfect square. But the thing that caught our attention most was the cabin. It stood right in the middle of the clearing, a small wooden cabin, much like the old shacks we'd come across before. But this one was different. It was burned, almost completely destroyed. Maybe my memory is exaggerating, but I swear I could still smell the smoke in the air and see the faintest wisps of blackened ash clinging to the structure. We approached in silence, slowly crossing the clearing together. The door, or what was left of it, hung crookedly, barely attached to its hinges. None of us wanted to go alone, but no one wanted to be the one to back out either. The steps groaned under our weight as we climbed onto the porch. Something about this place screamed at me to turn and run. My gut twisted in warning, but none of us left. I lifted my foot and kicked the door. It crumbled inward as if it were made of brittle paper. "Hello!" My voice was steadier than I felt. No response, only the thick, choking scent of burned wood. Inside, everything was charred. Bookshelves, a fireplace, even a rocking chair with half its back missing. Then we heard it, a dull thud. We spun around, scanning the room. Nothing. Another thump. This time, we looked at each other. No one was smiling anymore. The third time, we saw it. A trapdoor in the floor. A near-perfect square cut into the blackened boards. A rusted padlock held one side, old hinges on the other. And it was moving. The whole thing shifted slightly, sending a puff of ash into the air. The lock stretched. Another hit. Harder. We stood frozen, eyes locked on the trapdoor. It wasn't just shaking anymore, it was bending. Something beneath it was fighting to get out. Then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. A single, wild, staring eye peering up through the crack. I don't remember deciding to run, but suddenly I was sprinting. My friends were ahead of me, behind me, our footsteps pounding the dirt in a frantic rush to escape. I had never outrun any of them in my life, but the thought, the feeling of teeth snapping at my heels drove me forward. I passed every single one of them, We didn't stop until we reached the familiar old tree stump. There, we finally paused, hands on our knees, gasping for air. For a full 2 minutes, no one spoke. No one wanted to admit they had been scared. We just stared at each other, knowing without words that we had seen something different. That night, we walked home in silence. No one joked, no one laughed, and none of us ever brought it up again. The next day, we went back to playing in the woods, but we all understood the new rule, an unspoken one. We never went that far again, and none of us ever broke that rule. Maybe some things are better left unknown. Even now, thinking back as an adult, I can't make sense of what happened. But sometimes, I find myself wondering what was trying to escape, and how close had it been to getting out. That thought still chills me. My stepmom, Karen, grew up as a somewhat spoiled teenager in the late 60s. Her mother had relocated their family to the US from Scotland when she was around 10. She attended a well-regarded high school in an affluent area. That's where she befriended Rachel, who wasn't part of Karen's usual crowd, popular and trendy, but the two hit it off. Rachel was into outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, and boating, and she introduced Karen to these hobbies. My stepmom always had a bit of a moody expression, making her look uninterested in everything, but thanks to Rachel, she ended up joining in on these activities quite a bit. One Sunday, they decided to go hiking in some hills roughly an hour away. Karen put on what were likely her very pricey hiking boots, and the two set off toward the trails. Rachel parked in a large clearing with makeshift parking spots, marked by small wooden posts. There were no other cars in sight, a fact that only became significant later. They chose to hike off the trail since Rachel considered herself a bit of an adventurer. According to my stepmom, the trek wasn't anything special. She would mostly complain about how humid and full of bugs it was. When they finally reached the top, Karen was completely over it. Her more pampered side started showing, and she whined until Rachel agreed to take a break before heading back down at a slower pace. About 10 minutes into their descent, Karen started grumbling again. Rachel, trying to keep the peace, suggested they walk along the roadside instead of the rough hiking path. So there they were, dressed in full hiking gear, strolling down a worn-out road. Not long after, an old, beat-up truck rolled up beside them. It was a faded blue clunker, rusted in spots. The driver, a scruffy-looking guy with a full beard, long messy hair, and a baseball cap pulled low, leaned over and rolled down the window. He smiled through his beard and asked if they needed a ride. Karen later described him as somewhat charming, maybe even attractive. Rachel, however, said she immediately felt uneasy. Still, against her gut instinct, she let Karen persuade her to accept the ride. "It's just a quick 10-minute drive back to the car," Karen had insisted. They opened the passenger door, and the man motioned for them to climb into the back behind the seat. Settling in, they felt the truck start rumbling forward. Almost immediately, Rachel regretted their decision. The back seat was tidy enough, but she spotted a coil of rope on the floor behind the driver's seat and several rolls of plastic wrap partially sticking out from under the passenger seat. It gave her a bad feeling, but she didn't want to scare Karen, so she stayed quiet. After what felt longer than 10 minutes, they were still deep in the woods. No other cars had passed. Rachel asked how much farther, and the man replied that he was taking a different route down and needed to make a stop first. That was when she really started to panic. Karen and Rachel were both 16, and Rachel didn't want to push him too hard, fearing what he might do. She focused on little details about him, trying to memorize anything useful. His tangled, unwashed hair, the dried mud on his jacket collar. He was youngish, broad-shouldered, and taller than both of them by a few inches. He didn't offer any more details, and they didn't dare ask. Minutes later, they arrived at a small, shabby log cabin in the middle of a clearing. There was a large stump nearby with a massive axe embedded in a chunk of wood. Rachel's sense of dread skyrocketed. The man parked the truck, stepped out, and said, "Wait here, I'll be right back." Then he disappeared inside the cabin. Rachel immediately tried to convince Karen that something was seriously wrong, but Karen dismissed her worries at first. As Rachel's panic grew, she finally put her foot down and demanded they get out of the truck. Reluctantly, Karen followed. They made their way around the front of the vehicle, keeping their eyes on the cabin. Why the man left two teenage girls alone in his truck was a mystery, but they weren't about to wait and find out. Karen, still struggling with the idea of seeming rude, hesitated and even opened the truck door again, as if to climb back in. Rachel, furious, followed after her, only to see something that made her stomach drop. On the floor near the driver's seat was a small hatchet, its blade stained with what looked like dried brown and reddish marks. Some of it had even stuck to the floor. Rachel lost it. She started yelling at Karen to run, and Karen finally understood the gravity of the situation. Without wasting another second, they sprinted off the side of the property into the woods. They stumbled through the trees, panicked and disoriented, but Rachel was fairly certain they were making their way downhill. Karen sobbed the entire time, which made Rachel anxious that the man might hear them. Eventually, after what felt like forever, they emerged at the bottom of the hill, spotting the old wooden fence that marked the parking area. Relief flooded them until they noticed something that made their blood run cold. The truck was there, parked just across the makeshift lot, facing in their direction. It sat innocently, unmoving. They couldn't tell if anyone was inside. Karen wanted to sprint straight to the car, but Rachel, still on high alert, insisted they wait. She convinced Karen to crouch behind a large tree, concealed by bushes, and watch. With no cell phones or any way to call for help, this was the 60s, they had no choice but to sit tight. The lot was wide open, and if they misjudged, they could walk straight into a trap. They waited for what felt like hours. As dusk fell, the forest came alive with noises, and Karen grew restless, making it harder for Rachel to keep her calm. Just as Rachel was about to cave and make a run for it, they heard a sound, a soft clunk across the dimly lit lot. They watched in horror as one of the back doors of their car swung open. The bearded man slid out from the back seat, straightened up, and glanced around the area. He had been waiting inside their car the entire time. After a few moments of scanning the woods, he walked back to his truck, got in, and slowly drove off, disappearing down the road. They waited until he was completely out of sight before sprinting to their car, jumping in, and peeling out of there so fast they barely managed to shut the doors. If that man is still alive today, he'd be quite old. But they hoped they never run into him again. It was late October in the mountains of Northern California. It was a late afternoon, and I had just gotten back from the gym. After eating, I was ready to unwind when my buddy called, asking if I wanted to take my motorcycle out for a ride. This was something we did regularly, cruising around, blasting music, and soaking up the good vibes. The weather was ideal, warm, sunny, and clear, so I grabbed my keys and helmet and headed out. At first, we were just riding around, enjoying the music and the heat. After a while, my fuel gauge started dipping, so we decided to head back. That's when my friend suddenly pointed out a seemingly ordinary dirt path leading into the woods. We had nothing better to do, so we figured, why not? The trail was much steeper than it first appeared. So steep that my friend had to hop off while I struggled to get my bike up the incline. Once we reached even ground, I rode ahead a bit to see where the path led. It was mostly a winding dirt road weaving through thick trees. Then, off to the left, I noticed something odd. An opening in the forest with fresh tire marks leading down another trail. Seemed strange, but I brushed it off and kept riding. That's when I saw him. About 10 feet ahead, partially hidden by a curve in the road, a man stood next to a parked car. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I had a clear view of him. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing a dark cap and a gray zip-up jacket. Something about him felt wrong. My first thought was that we had wandered onto private property, but there were no signs, no gates, nothing indicating we weren't supposed to be there. Still, my gut told me to turn around. I rode back to my friend, who was catching his breath after trekking up the steep hill with his heavy helmet. I told him about the guy, and just as we debated whether to check out the side trail with the tire tracks, something made our stomachs drop. Headlights, The car was coming fast. My friend practically leaped onto the back of my motorcycle, and we sped off down the hill. As we hit the main road, I glanced in my mirror. The car was still behind us. It had turned onto the road and was following us, keeping pace, closing the distance. My pulse skyrocketed. The guy was tailing us. Thinking fast, I took a sharp turn onto a smaller road I had used before, one that led to a bicycle path. When we looked back, the car had stopped, just sitting there, watching. Then, after what felt like forever, it slowly drove away. Alone in the silence, we laughed it off, trying to shake the lingering fear. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe we had just overreacted. But then, curiosity got the better of us. We looked up the area on Google Earth. At first, everything seemed normal, just a road with a few scattered houses. But then we saw something strange. Old satellite images showed multiple houses along the path, but one in particular stood out. It had been well kept, with neatly trimmed grass and a camper parked outside. Yet, in the most recent images, it was gone, completely erased. Where it had once been, there was now just an empty, overgrown lot, as if the house had never existed. Even stranger, when we tried to follow the road further on Google Earth, the path abruptly blurred out. The end of the road was completely obscured, like someone had deliberately erased it. We couldn't let it go. We weren't planning to return so soon, but the mystery gnawed at us. This time, we brought another friend and took a car instead of the bike. And I wish we hadn't. The road felt different. Paths that should have been familiar seemed off. But the biggest shock? A cabin. It hadn't been there before. I was absolutely sure of that. We had looked at that exact spot last time, and there had been nothing but trees. Yet now, a weathered old cabin stood there, looking like it had been sitting for decades, yet somehow still maintained. Then we found a roadblock, a fresh one. Someone had put up a barricade blocking the final stretch of the trail. We had no choice but to leave the car behind and continue on foot. The closer we got to the end of the trail, the worse the feeling became. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the sensation of being watched growing unbearable. And then we saw it, a nondescript building surrounded by a massive fence. Next to it, a camouflage-painted tower stretched above the treetops. And then the sign, a government warning, explicitly stating that taking photos was illegal. That was enough for me. We turned around immediately, making our way back to the roadblock. Before leaving, we decided to check out the mysterious cabin. My friend went up to the window while I stayed back, an awful feeling twisting in my stomach. He only peeked inside for a second before his entire body went rigid. Then he bolted. I didn't ask questions, I just ran after him. We jumped into the car, and as I sped away, I finally got him to speak. The inside was staged, he said, his voice shaky, like too perfect, too clean. It didn't look real. Then he told me the creepiest part. On the table inside, there had been a steaming cup of coffee. Someone had just been there, watching us. Ever since, I've been analyzing the Google Earth images, and something is seriously wrong. That house, the one with the camper and the trimmed lawn, it's gone. The other houses are still there, but this one has been completely erased like it never existed. But I know what I saw, and I don't know what's going on out there, but it's not normal. My fiancé and I had just moved into a tiny cabin at the base of a mountain, surrounded by thick forest. It was our first night there. No furniture yet, just an air mattress on the floor. The closest neighbors were far down the road, too distant to see or hear from our place. It felt isolated. I was setting up the air mattress while my fiancé was in the shower when, all at once, the atmosphere shifted. A heavy, buzzing charge filled the air, like the moment right before a lightning strike. My skin tingled, the hairs on my arms stood up. Before I could react, the air mattress suddenly caved in. The edges suctioned to the floor while the middle lifted in an unnatural arc. I just stood there, frozen, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I felt something. I turned to my right, and in the doorway, hovering at head height, was a glowing sphere of blue light about the size of a basketball. It wasn't a steady glow. It shifted and swirled, almost like living cells dividing under a microscope. The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on me. Everything was completely silent. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe a few seconds, maybe longer, but then, in an instant, the orb shot straight at me. I threw myself to the side, landing hard on the air mattress just as the glowing sphere zipped past my head. Without slowing down, it blasted through the closed window and vanished into the trees. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the unbroken glass. There was no hole, no crack, no sign that anything had passed through at all. That night, I was so shaken I couldn't even bring myself to tell my fiancé. I just sat there, replaying the moment over and over in my head. Even now, my hands shake when I think about it. Every night after that, from the woods just east of our cabin, we would hear horrible, gut-wrenching screams. They weren't animal noises, they sounded human, but warped, unnatural. Eventually, I worked up the courage to ask a man who lived further down the road if he'd ever heard them. He just shrugged and said, "Oh yeah, probably that homeless woman who lives out there. She's off her meds." His casual response unsettled me even more. Why was this woman screaming like that every single night? And if it really was her, why hadn't anyone done anything? Despite the uneasiness, I tried to settle into life at the cabin. In my free time, I liked panning for gold, and we had a small creek just 50 steps from our front door, one of the only things I truly enjoyed about the place. One afternoon, I was crouched by the water, sifting through the sand, just off to the side of a little wooden bridge. That's when an old pickup truck rolled up. The driver, a man in his late 50s or 60s with a weathered face and serious expression, rolled down his window. "You got a gun on you?" he asked. I blinked, caught off guard. No, but I have bear spray." His face didn't change. "It's not the bears or cougars you need to be worried about in these woods." Then, without another word, he drove off. I stood there, watching his taillights disappear, a cold feeling creeping into my stomach. Years later, a friend introduced me to a paranormal podcast, mostly stories about strange creatures and unexplained encounters. I almost didn't believe what I was hearing. Dozens of people describing the exact same glowing orb I had seen that night. I had always thought legends of creatures in the woods were just that, stories, folklore. But now, I don't know what to believe anymore. We sold the cabin a few years later, and to this day I still wonder who or what is out there. The Austrian mountains. ***, I must have been around 7*** when my father decided we should take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin he planned to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea, a perfect chance for us to spend time together away from everyday distractions. So that's exactly what we did. My parents, my sister, and I packed up the car and left early on a Friday morning, hoping to get a good start on the long, winding drive through the frost-covered countryside. When we arrived, the cold hit me instantly. The air was sharp and crisp, and the ground was already dusted with a thin layer of snow. It made sense, considering December was just around the corner. We unpacked our bags, settled into the small wooden lodge, and chose our sleeping spots. After a warm meal by the crackling fire, we all went to bed, eager to explore the forest the next day. That night, though, something strange happened. As I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching through the frost. Curious, I peeked out the window but saw only the dark silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to sleep. But about 15 minutes later, the footsteps returned. This time, I woke my older sister, who was 10, and we crept to the window together. For a brief moment, we caught sight of a figure standing near the tree line. We couldn't make out any details, just a bulky shape. Fear prickled through me. We quickly ducked below the window, whispering nervously before deciding to ignore it and try to sleep. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, the scent of sizzling bacon and the comforting hum of my mother's voice filled the cabin. I asked if I could go outside to help my dad, who was already chopping wood nearby. My sister stayed inside, still groggy from our restless night. I ran out and found my father deep in conversation with a man I had never seen before. The stranger was short and stocky, with a shaved head and a worn-out military jacket. His cheeks were flushed, and despite the cold, sweat glistened on his forehead. As I approached, my dad looked at me and said, "This is my son," introducing me by name. The man gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Nice to meet you, kid. I'm Victor." His gaze lingered on me a bit too long, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "You look nervous. Are you okay?" The man coughed awkwardly. Yeah, he forced a grin. "Just old memories. I'm a vet." My dad gave him a sympathetic nod, and I didn't question it, though something about him unsettled me. Victor claimed he was staying in a nearby cabin with his family and had come over to introduce himself. My dad, always friendly, invited him inside for breakfast, which Victor accepted. At the table, he asked me questions, what games I liked, what hobbies I had. He seemed friendly enough, but something still felt off. After breakfast, I went outside to play while my dad continued chopping wood. At one point, I tripped and scraped my knee on a jagged rock. Tears welled in my eyes as I inspected the bloody scratch. Victor appeared almost immediately, offering to help. "Come to my cabin. I have bandages." My dad was inside helping my mom at that moment, and I was too naive to think twice. I followed Victor into the woods. We walked much farther than I expected. The cold stung my cheeks, and my knee throbbed. "How much further?" I asked. Victor just kept saying, "Almost there." After what felt like 20 minutes, we reached a small, run-down cabin. It didn't look like the well-maintained rentals I'd seen earlier. "Where's your family?" I asked as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and scattered clothes littered the floor. Victor avoided my question for a moment before muttering, "Out for a walk. Come, let's take care of that knee." He knelt beside me, placing a bandage over the scrape. His hand lingered on my leg, rubbing it slowly. "Strong legs," he said with an odd smile. "That's good." Panic welled in my chest. I stood up abruptly, mumbling that I should go back. Victor's smile faltered. "No need to rush," he said, stepping in front of the door. "Stay, have some lunch." My heart pounded as I scanned the room for another exit. "My parents will be looking for me." He waved a dismissive hand. "I told them you're with me." He was lying. Just then, a door to the back room creaked open. A frail woman with hollow eyes stepped out. She looked straight at me and whispered, "Help me." Victor spun around, furious. "Get back inside." The woman flinched and retreated into the room. Victor slammed the door and turned back to me with a chilling smile. "Don't mind her. She's sick. Now," he continued, "let's find you some new clothes." I bolted for the door, yanked it open, and ran into the forest. Behind me, I heard Victor shout and give chase. My heart hammered as I sprinted through the snow, tree branches whipping my face. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to get away. His heavy footsteps crunched behind me, closing in. Then, finally, I saw a familiar clearing, the cabin. My father stood outside, his eyes widening as he saw me sprinting toward him. "Victor," I gasped. "He's not who he says he is. He tried to keep me there." My dad didn't hesitate. He rushed inside, called the police, then grabbed his axe. The authorities arrived soon after, but by the time they got to Victor's cabin, it was empty. They found ropes, duct tape, and children's clothes that weren't mine. The woman was gone. Victor was gone. The police told us no one had rented that cabin for months. We left that same day. My dad kept checking the rearview mirror the entire drive home. The police never gave us any updates. We never found out who Victor really was or what happened to that woman. But I still have nightmares about that night. It all started as just another weekend trip.